of 2024. And I'm always really grateful to see folks returning week after week or session after session. And I hope that means you're enjoying it and getting something out of it, both from what I'm sharing, but also from what you're getting from your colleagues. And once again, we'll kind of have a similar format to the past few sessions where there'll be a lot of opportunity for small group conversations, and even some whole group conversations too. So, and it's a somewhat small group today, which is, kind of nice because we keep it intimate. So I'm really grateful to Campus Compact for allowing me to continue on as their faculty development fellow and support this faculty learning community. So every January, there's about 8 community engagement directors from different Catholic universities across the West Coast. We come together for 24 hours for a retreat and just have lots of opportunities to kind of unpack how things are going for us and reflecting on, the year that we just came through and the year ahead. And we occasionally will have a facilitator come in. And so I have definitely referenced Grace Lee Boggs' scholarship and activism in my work for a number of years. But this quote was shared with me at the retreat a couple of weeks ago, and it really stuck with me. I was actually surprised that it hadn't stuck with me previously from my encounters with her work. And it feels like a great way to sort of ground us in this space today. So I just want to share it. I'll read it aloud and we can just sort of sit with it for a moment. We need to create a much more intimate connection between intellectual development and practical activity, to root students and faculty in their communities and natural habitats, and to engage them in the kind of real problem solving in their localities that nurtures a love of place and provides practice in creating the sustainable economies, equality, and community that are the responsibility of citizenship. And I think, as a field, I feel like we are underutilizing the work of Grace Lee Boggs. I mean, I definitely know there are individuals who are very much influenced by it, but I don't see her referenced a lot in our scholarship. And so much of her work really is about this very thing, right? Like, how do we do informed activism? How do we partner universities with community-rooted organizations? How do we build our capacities to make change? So I just wanted to kind of start with that as the foundation for our conversation today. And then I wanted to bring up this little roadmap of where we've been and where we're going. So this is our 3rd session. And of course, our first session, we really tried to focus on building community among us and clarifying our own individual motivations. Last time we gathered, we were really focusing on community engaged course design and the foundations and frameworks that you can draw on to help you structure your course. This one might be my favorite session, really focusing in on partnering with community co-educators. And I think, I just want to name that for a long time, I actually used to do the student engagement session before the community partner session. So you can see the student engagement session will happen in session 4. And one of the things I've learned over time is, how it can change the trajectory of a course when we kind of start first with thinking about the community relationships and the communities we want to work with. So we're trying that out and kind of experimenting with that here in our FLC. We'll talk about students next time in March, and then in April, we'll focus on integrating critical reflection and assessment, and then we'll end with infusing more kind of critical approaches to community engaged teaching. So that's our roadmap of where we're going. We're in session 3, and our agenda for today, this is the welcome. We'll do a check-in in a moment. We'll use that chat as we have in the past so we can get to know who's in the room. And then move you pretty quickly into a small group conversation about community. And then we'll spend some time unpacking what do we typically mean by community when in the context of community engaged learning, how can we redefine or kind of reimagine our ideas of community as we're doing community engaged work, and then put forward some principles. We'll do another small group discussion where you can share and discuss some of the partnership questions and concerns that you're grappling with. And then we'll go into more practical, some steps for building partnerships and envisioning community partners as co-educators. And then the last piece, there'll be some reflection for you, some reflection time for you to kind of think through, okay, given what we've talked about today, who are the partners we want to work with? Which communities are we hoping to work alongside, and get some clarity around that for yourselves before we close out. So that's the plan. And again, welcome to everyone. Thanks for being here with each other and with me. And for those of you who have been coming each time, you know that I like to use the chat since we're just a slightly larger group, that it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to take a lot of time to do verbal introductions around the room. So for today, in the chat, if you could just share, name and pronouns, your institutional affiliation and role. And then, in one word or one phrase, what's the most important ingredient in a healthy partnership? So I'll give you a moment to start putting your answers in the chat. And then I may invite a couple people, just as I look, I may invite a couple people to share why you chose your ingredient if you're willing. So think about whether you want to speak into the group. So I'm seeing communication, listening to learn. Another communication. Trust, respect. More communication. Building trust, healthy listening. Ooh, I'm curious about that one. Shared vision. Transparency. That's the one that came to mind for me too, Joe. All right. So I think let's give it just a couple more seconds. Reciprocity. Wonderful. So maybe we can have, if anyone is open to just speaking into the group, and you can just feel free to unmute yourself. Why did you choose, the ingredient that you chose? Or if you want to share any other insights about it. Passion for the work. Anyone want to share?
Well, hi, Star. Do I need to come off? Oh, yeah, I'll come on video too. I'm not sure if anyone can see me anyway, but I picked communication because I feel like a lot of this stuff is very important. The trust, mutual, reciprocity, but even if you have those things and you don't communicate, it's going to fall apart. Oh, I'm a talking head, literally.
Yeah.
So,
we see you.
so even if you've got a long-term partner you've been working with for years, if you don't explicitly communicate, it could still go awry.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
I'll share. So the one that has been on my mind a lot lately is just this, how we do listening well, because I think as kind of academics, I think a lot of us have kind of been trained to talk more than we listen, right? We're kind of expected to be experts and to be sharing our knowledge out into the world. And so I've found that in working with faculty that it's the listening, and really listening, not to respond, but to really be like, okay, so this is what's important to you, or this is, what I'm hearing is this, kind of like therapy, but that's what I think sometimes gets overlooked, how important that is.
Yeah. Yeah. And then sort of the implications of these things. Communication takes time. Really deeply listening takes time, right? It takes attention. And so, I feel like that's the subtext is like, to do this work well requires a lot of time and labor and attention and energy, in a context of a university where often we're not afforded such luxuries, right? So just kind of naming that can be a tension that we're grappling with too. Anyone else want to share before we move into our small groups? All right, there'll be plenty of time for you to talk to each other and the rest of us. So this is fun. I always enjoy doing this. I went to a workshop years ago where we had to do this, and I thought it was so clever, and I loved hearing people's responses to this. So in a couple of minutes, you're going to move into your small groups that you'll stick with through the next couple of hours. And you're going to take turns sharing with each other. What is community like, right? So you're going to come up with a little analogy. And the example that was used years ago that resonated most with me that I sort of adopted was community is like a bicycle, with each person representing a different part of the bike, and all the parts have to work together for the bike to move forward. And I just thought that was such a cool and clever way of understanding community, that community is moving in a direction, moving forward. And that everyone has a part to play, right? And that we all have to figure out sort of how we fit together and work together. So in a moment, Nicole will put you into small groups of, I'm guessing, probably 3 to 5 people. And I'll give you about 10 minutes. And so just take some time to think about the analogy that feels best for you as you think about community. And then you'll share that with each other. Community is like blank, and sort of explain why you chose that analogy. And then we'll come back together after about 10 minutes. All right, I think we have everyone back. If 10 minutes doesn't feel like enough time for folks as we move forward, we have a couple more small group conversations. Just, let me know in the chat, and we can extend the time a little bit. I wanted to just leave a few minutes in case anybody wanted to share a particularly interesting or profound analogy for community that was shared in your group, or maybe one that you came up with that you just want to share with the rest of the group.
Star?
Yes.
Yeah, my mind's blown by Joyce because she talked about how community is a human construct. And I'm still wrapping my mind around that one.
Yeah, wonderful. This is the value of these small group conversations.
We had a lovely conversation in our group with Carmen and Lee. They both proposed a band or an orchestra, as as an analogy. And I've sort of borrowed theirs and it's like, can I add on? Because I started from thinking, what's the kind of system where you can have flexibility and kind of adaptability? And so like maybe a jazz band, right? So you've got some form, there's some structure, but then you have kind of an opportunity for, call and response and listening and adjusting. And then Carmen posed a great question about what community, sometimes we're in groups and it just feels like a group. Is that a community? Is it a dysfunctional community? What a healthy, so we talked a little bit more about kind of, what does community mean? Because we can be in these, smaller groups in our units or departments or large, our institutions or, local town or state, right? And so, Carmen really presented a good question there about,
what do we mean by community? So that was a lot of fun in our group.
Thank you so much. And I think, that's a great example of, this is something you can do with your students, right? Just right from the start to get them thinking about community in a different way. And hopefully some of those questions will be generated in their conversations, or those are questions you can pose as sort of a follow-up after students have shared the analogies that they have come up with. So I think it's a really great way to just begin to plant those seeds of reframing our understanding of community and kind of making it more nuanced and complex, because what we often mean, or what's often assumed when we talk about community within this idea of community engaged learning, tends to be students often interpret it, and often faculty initially will interpret it as the community is an underserved neighborhood or a marginalized group, right? That's kind of immediately where folks heads will sort of go. That then often these communities that we're going to be working with tend to be defined by their challenges, the issues they're facing, the problems they're dealing with. Might be defined in, through deficit lenses and deficit terminology. Terms like the homeless or at-risk youth might be, and those are terms that might be used by community organizations we're working with, even when we're not necessarily using those terms, or we're careful to not put forward those terms ourselves. Usually we're talking about, the community being off campus or outside of our campus. It could be an adjacent neighborhood, or sometimes we're, bringing students abroad. And one of the things I like to talk with students about is how any of the injustices that are happening in the communities surrounding our institution are also happening to some degree within our institutions, right? So things like students experiencing food insecurity, and students experiencing housing insecurity, and certainly racism and sexism, and all of those things are happening within our campuses as well as in the communities around us. And so how do we just see that as something that's affecting us, directly, as well as the folks beyond our campus walls? Often there's an assumption that the students in the class maybe aren't from the communities that you'll be working with, or don't share identities with the community. And so this, it's not necessarily wrong to see, depending on the communities you're working with, some of these things might be true in terms of it is a neighborhood that's historically been underserved. Maybe it is a neighborhood where students confirm that they don't have any, they didn't live there, they don't have any connections there. But how do we just trouble our assumptions around that and really try to get clarity? And then how can it be beneficial to kind of redefine community away from these sort of narrow understandings of what it means when we're thinking about community engaged learning? So in that spirit, I encountered this great article by Thakrar, Ken, and Minkley in 2014, and they did this. They wrote an article where they synthesized 3 themes from over 63 definitions of community from various constituencies involved in community engagement. And I believe it was, they're even sort of geographically spread out around the world. So it was very much kind of from an international perspective, not just US based. And the 3 themes that came up in their findings were the existence of a common substance among individuals, not necessarily a common shared identity, but some, could be that, but it could be something else that brings folks together that they share in common. It could be resources that they share, it could be interests, it could be geographical location, some sort of sense of emotional connection or a sense of belonging to a group is what makes community. And as I was reading this, I felt like I started to think, well, this is more of like the ideal, sort of the ideal community that we're striving to create, not necessarily, a label that we would give to a group or people who are sharing a geographic or spatial location. So, the shared geographic and spatial location, that might seem obvious for some of us. That's often maybe the first thing we think about when we're identifying communities, but how do we also account for the emotional connection, the sense of belonging, and some kind of shared substance? And going deeper into that, they talk more about this human connection. And, in communities, and maybe I'll use the term more ideal communities or aspirational communities, that there's some evidence that there's a bond, a sense of solidarity, that people's well-being is connected to each other, and even this sense of feeling of love. Minkley, from that initial article, talked about their own definition, which was a sum total of shared experiences that includes experiences of oppression and exploitation, but also experiences of resistance and liberation, right? And so how are we making sure, as we're connecting students with communities that they may be outsiders to, that they're seeing that fuller picture of where our community is experiencing oppression or exploitation, but then also where and how are they enacting resistance and liberation in the face of that. And then Thakrar gives their definition and talks about community including differences, disagreements, and dissenters, right? So, and we'll talk more in a moment about sometimes students and faculty and can sort of think about community as this monolith where people are all thinking the same, wanting the same things. And obviously doesn't make sense. It's not true. And so how do we help students understand that within communities, there's all these distinctions across people's capacities, beliefs, identities, ways of understanding community, injustices, and how to address those injustices. All of those things are true within a community. And then this notion of a sense of place, which makes me think a lot about place-based initiatives, which so many of our institutions have developed in the past few years. Some sort of emotional bond between a geographic location and a group. And I feel like that's something that just really we need to be more attentive to. So my colleagues and I are working with this organization called the Japanese Community Youth Council. And the executive director grew up in San Francisco's Japantown. He was one of the first children to go to that organization when it started back in the 60s. It came out of these collaborations between college students at San Francisco State University who were agitating for ethnic studies and open admissions, and high school students who were, seeing their own community being kind of threatened and oppressed. And they came together, they created this Japanese Community Youth Council, which was very much sort of an activist organization that provided safe spaces for youth and then taught them how to build their power to protect their communities. But it was also very much about cross-racial organizing and solidarity as well. And the executive director used to be a child there. And when we came to learn about the organization and figure out more ways we could be involved with them, he took us on a tour of the neighborhood, right? And it was so clear that everything he's done as executive director is really driven by that emotional bond, that history he has there, and his reverence for the history that he's trying to preserve. And so if we recognize that there are folks in our communities who have that depth of connection, how do we honor that? How do we connect with that? How do we help students see the importance of that sense of place and geographic connection? And then in certain places, the culture is shaped by the geographic context. So how do we help students and faculty kind of understand that and unpack that? So I like to just kind of redefine community and think about it in these ways because, what would it mean if we started by helping students understand community in more complex and nuanced ways, and then invited them to figure out their own place in these communities, their responsibilities and roles, their own needs for belonging and support as an entry point for working in solidarity with folks in the communities they're engaging. So kind of moving from there, in the book that Marshall and I wrote, we provide some guiding principles for engaging community. So I just want to go, and maybe actually before I go into this, I'm curious if anyone just has, in terms of thinking about redefining community or some of those assumptions that a lot of people start with around community, any insights folks want to share, any questions that came up around those things?
This is Joyce. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. In our group, what Alice was referring to was I was teaching my students a couple nights ago, and we were talking about how do you define community. And so one of the things I said to them was we talked about it being one of the human expressions that has to do with interconnectedness and engagement and things like that. And as we talked through, one of the students said, as we can imagine, it's true. So she said it's awesome to learn about community in this broader, more complex perspective, because that makes me feel like and know that we can build community. If it's a human construct, I'm not born in this situation and I have nothing I can do. I have to live in isolation if I don't have what I need. But we can go out and build that, and understanding the intersectionality of the multiple communities that we are part of. Like you said, some are of the built community or physical or environmental or territorial, but also relational and those things like that. And so it is a powerful thing to help people, students and faculty, like you said, understand community or redefine community in ways that we probably had not thought about, such as that.
Yeah, I love that distinction between it just being something you're kind of born into or dropped into, or yeah, just sort of occupying a space within, versus like, how are you actively creating, refining, redefining it through your participation. And the other thing that, and we talked about this, I think, in our very first session, that I always feel like, often we're talking about community engaged learning and sort of whatever groups or organization or communities we're having our students work alongside, but the importance of building that community internally as well, right? And I think that's such a valuable sort of practice of like, how do we attend to the community within our classroom and then allow that to inform how we also are connecting with folks in the communities beyond our classroom through this as well. Go ahead, Carmen. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, while you were showing all those elements of a community, I was uncomfortable because in my experience, communities don't exist. You build them or you don't. Like my classroom is not a community unless I intentionally do things to make it sort of a community. And that's my main issue here. Like community doesn't go with the verb to be. It's like to make or to build, no?
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to help our students understand. I think that's what we're trying to figure out how to live into in our community engaged practice as well, is how do we create that? It doesn't just happen, right? And so to sort of assume that your classroom is a community when you haven't done the work of like helping students build those connections, right? That can actually be super harmful, because then maybe you're asking them to be vulnerable in a way. And I think the same is true as we send our students out to do community engaged work. Like, how do we make sure they know they have to build those relationships? They have to build those connections with people and engender some of that trust in order to be able to contribute meaningfully to those communities. So I totally agree. I mean, I think the things I'm sharing here is not something that just happens, right? It's like requires intentional work around that. And I mean, I think certainly if anyone else wants to share, feel free, but hopefully some of these guiding principles move us in that direction as well. So just jumping into these, one of the things we talk about in the book is this idea of like the myth of the monolith, right? We say, okay, we're going to go out and work with, I'll give the example of the adjacent neighborhood to University of San Francisco, which is called the Western Addition. And the Western Addition is both a historically Black neighborhood, but then kind of adjacent to that and included within the Western Addition is a historically Japanese and Japanese American neighborhood, right? And so both were affected by, obviously the Japanese community affected by internment, and then most of the Black community by redevelopment. And so, you know, here is this community that sort of has this umbrella term of the Western Addition, but of course within it, there's different ethnicities and races and historical experiences of displacement that obviously continue to have effects. And so how do we lift up and kind of unpack sort of the distinct experiences of various groups within communities or neighborhoods that have otherwise been sort of labeled in a way that might make us think that they're homogenous. How are we moving from this notion of doing, you know, serving for or doing for to working alongside or working with? I talk with students a lot about how can we see ourselves as apprentices? How do we like enter into community spaces, community organizations with this idea that we're there to be apprentices to the people leading change, right? In the way that you would imagine an apprentice working alongside a skilled, you know, a skilled craftsperson, a carpenter or something like that. So how can we move from doing for, serving, some of those kind of one directional understandings of what engagement looks like to working with and alongside and being apprentices. Moving from that notion of placement to partnership, I have to say, I mean, I think at USF, we do require faculty need to be in direct relationship with the community organizations that they're working with or the community leaders that are hosting students. That's sort of the model that we've put forward, really so that there's that relationship of accountability between faculty and community partner, and that they're able to, you know, together hold students accountable for making sure that they're benefiting community and not doing harm. I think, you know, there's a lot of reasons why placement models continue to persist, but I think, you know, there's a lot of ways that there can be disconnects within those placement models as well. So how do we move toward partnership? Which really gets back to that notion of to be in community means to be in relationship with folks. Moving from that deficit perspective that I talked about a bit earlier to an asset or desire perspective. So I know folks are quite familiar with Kretzmann and McKnight's asset-based community development model. One thing that we have tried to do in our center, kind of in an effort to make sure that we're decolonizing our work, lifting up voices of women and people of color, we've moved to really using Eve Tuck's model in her article on suspending damage, where she talks about desire-based. It's really about community engaged research, not so much about community engaged learning, but it definitely can translate. But she talks about desire-based community research versus damage-based, right? And that a lot of folks from universities come in with like sort of fetishizing this desire to like collect data around the damage. And what would it mean for communities to push back and instead say, you can come in and work with us to really identify what are our desires, right? And allow that to lead us, allow that data to kind of inform our next steps. And so we try to kind of bring that framework into preparing our students, looking at like desire-centered community engagement, meaning how do we immerse ourselves in community, work alongside folks with an eye toward where are the desires, where are it's kind of like assets, but you know, where are the places that there's aspiration and goals and objectives that folks are working toward? Where are the sites of like, you know, the sparks, and how do we lift those up? Honor the history and current context of community. So I talked about that a little bit in the example of the JCYC. I would say, you know, this is a really great area to draw upon your institutional librarians, community partners, local historians. We have had some of our community partners do community walks for students, similar to the one that we went on with our friends at JCYC. Librarians have pulled together different historical resources and references to help students learn about the histories of different communities. So I think that's a great way to just help students understand the current realities of the communities they're working with. How are we mindful of insider and outsider status and the implications of that? And for students who are coming into communities that they don't have any sort of obvious connections around affinity, identity, culture, et cetera, how do we help them sort of enter into those spaces with humility and cultural humility, and recognize the limits of what they're able to provide because of that outsider status, and also the responsibilities that might come with being an outsider in terms of deferring to community-rooted knowledge, being there to, you know, support the visions of folks who are already there doing the work and that kind of thing. Aspiring towards this notion of beloved community. So we talk a little bit about this in the book. And I think this is a great framework to put forward for students. If we are trying to cultivate this, you know, beloved community in the spirit of how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned it, what can we do within this course? What can we do within this community engaged learning to move us in that direction, right? So I think that can be a helpful paradigm, again, to get them out of this notion of them sort of coming in to a community to do something for them in a bounded time frame and that sort of thing. So I'd love to hear if you have other principles or insights you would want to add to these in terms of helping us just think in new ways or critical ways about engaging with our communities. Anything else to add or share? Or any questions or challenges to this? Anything you would revise or refine? Okay. Yes, Alice.
I mean, more of an acknowledgement that, you know, like I'm looking at the second bullet point from 4 to with. That's hard, you know, like, I think it's harder to just properly engage with the community in true reciprocity than you would think. I feel like it's a constant reset. It's something that constantly has to be top of mind. And just an acknowledgement of that, I think.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, I feel like that's probably true for so many of these, right? It's so much easier said than done. And particularly, and we're kind of moving from thinking about community more broadly to working with organizations and working with community partners, within broader communities or serving broader communities. And a lot of the time, the organizations that we work with are very much set up to work for, right? They're very much set up in this charity framework. And a lot of the language and rhetoric that comes out of these organizations reinforces some of the things that we might actively be trying to subvert or disrupt through community engaged learning. And so then how do we navigate that, right? Where you go to an organization where the language they use to talk about the folks they serve is very deficit oriented, or so I completely appreciate that perspective, that these, it's hard, and it kind of takes a constant critical analysis, and also interrogating some of the limitations. Like, these are aspirational, and then kind of what's it looking like in practice, right? Because there's there's friction that keeps us from getting to those aspirations so easily. And then Julie, I'm just noticing what you're sharing in the chat. I don't know if you want to share anything out loud about this.
I guess I just, there are definitely populations of our community where students feel the difference very strongly, even though they may not actually even recognize that they may have a classmate right next to them who has experienced something like houselessness, right? And so it may not be, I don't know, I like doing some sort of activity where they kind of acknowledge and think through what they have in their head, what assumptions, what biases, all of that going into it, and kind of thinking through what does that mean in this dynamic that students sometimes carry, which does a lot of harm, of helper and helped, right? That like, I'm one and you're the other, and how do you kind of help them see we're all in this together? And I could be on the other side of that, and not that difficult situation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that to your point, and sort of the theme throughout is we really have to intentionally disrupt what has sort of become the status quo of understanding community, having these us versus them, or these othering sort of mindsets that students are carrying in from their own socialization. And yeah, so creating time and space in our classes to really have students reflect on the assumptions and ideas that they're bringing in, and then challenging them to understand, how easily someone could get to the place of being unhoused or food insecure, and that nobody's really immune to it. Joyce, go ahead.
Yes, you lower my hand right now. This is an exciting conversation because I teach in the School of Social Work at UT Arlington, and I teach in the specialty of community administrative practice. So this is all of what I teach anyway. One of the things that I was just sharing with my students a couple of sessions ago, and this is an in-person class, that so as any professional, no matter what your degree is in, we have to understand, and I'll speak as them as social work graduate level students, that you're going to be working with multidisciplinary teams, people from different disciplines whose values that we're taught, our values and our codes of ethics and the things that we focus on are very different. And teaching them, because social workers, we are geared toward advocacy, we're geared toward us and strengths and all of that. I said, but you have to understand that every discipline doesn't focus on the same set of things. And so it would help us to go in appreciating that and learning and kind of building those connections with our colleagues that are in other disciplines as well. Because again, as social workers, we go in wanting, to support a higher quality of life, and this is what we're doing. And so, but sometimes, I don't know, you may get frustrated that your colleagues or some of the people we're working with don't have that same perspective, again, unless they've been taught like what you're doing here. And so really, as students, being appreciating that we're part of a team. No one person is going to make macro level impactful long-term change. It doesn't happen. And so learning how to build the connections and relationship with folks to understand we're a team and we're not supposed to be fighting each other. We do well to understand each other and kind of partner in that way, and not expect everyone to think like we do, but we can certainly get on the same page and understanding each other's values. That's what I had.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I'm just thinking, sorry, we go on a little bit of a bird walk. But Joyce, you're just making me think too, that sometimes it can be helpful to provide students with a framework of understanding different roles that people might take in facilitating community change or facilitating social change. And this is a shout out to Nicole Springer, because she's the one who introduced me to this book, which is The Social Change Now, a guide for reflection and connection. And it's the social change ecosystem. It's by Deepa Iyer. I'm seeing some nods, so maybe others have heard of it. And it actually, there's like this beautiful I'm trying to see if I can find the visual. But there's sort of this beautiful visual of like all the different roles people can play, right? Like caregivers and healers and storytellers and disruptors and weavers. And so again, as we try to help students think about all the different roles in community, and also that it's an active process and that we need people contributing their own, you know, their specific gifts and talents in different ways. I think this is a super helpful model as well. So I'll just, I can put the citation in the chat in a minute, but thank you so much, Joyce, because that totally sparked, you know, like helping us to see outside of our narrow disciplinary focus or like cultural and identity-based focus, and recognize other, you know, so many different ways that change can happen. So let's get you into small groups. I feel like there's some good energy right here. As I said, I want to kind of move us from thinking more broadly about community to thinking more specifically about, okay, as we're working with community partner organizations, which tend to be nonprofits or advocacy organizations, maybe schools, maybe some government agencies, depending on how your course is set up. And, you know, there's a lot of challenges with working with these organizations while also trying to work with and alongside the community, because often these organizations aren't representative of the communities they're serving, not necessarily always serving their best interests. And so let's dig into just some of your questions and concerns about partnering with organizations or about your community partnerships for your course. So I'll invite Nicole to put you back into your groups. We'll do another probably 10 minutes or so, unless anyone wants to speak up and say they want longer. And you'll just be sharing some of the questions and concerns you grapple with around community partnerships. So we'll come back maybe about 11 after the hour. Hi, everyone. Okay, while you were talking, I was trying to find some of the resources that we were talking about. So I think if I just popped the link to the Kretzmann and McKnight text that they've published many things. This one is old, but it was kind of the original one that I have seen a number of folks use and continue to use. The Eve Tuck on suspending damage, share, hopefully, let me know if you're not able to access these. And then Deepa Iyer has a pretty robust website. And I highly recommend you order her book. Again, I don't know if Nicole wants to chime in. I know she's not feeling well, but Nicole was the one who introduced me to Deepa. Sorry, Deepa Iyer. Her work. So, and it looks like Chicory, it looks like you've shared something also. Is that with this group or maybe in your small group? Thank you. Great. Yeah, hopefully. I think last time I think we have a culture where people feel comfortable just, you know, sharing resources with the rest of us in the chat. So please feel free to keep doing that. And just want to invite anyone, maybe we can hear, you know, from someone from each of the groups about, you know, what are some questions that are coming up for you or concerns that are coming up as you think about community partnerships. Anything you want to share? All right, well, hopefully you had lots of good conversation in your small groups. And of course, as questions and concerns come up, you can always just unmute and share them. I'll go ahead and go back to, hold on, I'm gonna go ahead and go back to sharing the screen. And talking a little bit about questions that you might want to ask yourself as you are thinking about cultivating community partnerships. So how many community partners should I work with? I feel like that's such a common question among faculty. You know, often I think they're trying to think from a student lens of, oh, I want to give folks lots of choice. I want to try to have diverse opportunities so students can plug into the things that they're most passionate about. And I appreciate that approach. And right, you know that then in practice, if you have multiple partnerships you're trying to sustain, it's, you know, it magnifies or multiplies the work around the communication and the relationship stewardship. So think about how many relationships you can manage around communications, project oversight, etc. I usually tell faculty when they're just starting off, you know, if you can find 2 or 3 good partners to work with that can work with you and your students, that's probably a good place to start. And then from there, you might find that you want to work with more next time or fewer, right? And I think there's a lot of beauty in those relationships too, where it's one community partner for the entire class. And I think that creates a really exciting and interesting dynamic when that can happen. But I think that can also be rare. Should I allow students to choose their community partners? We try to really discourage faculty from allowing that as the default. I know a number of faculty at USF will have pre-existing partnerships, but then be open if a student has a partnership or has been working, you know, historically with an organization and that aligns with the course content and outcomes. They might make an exception for that student because it still aligns with the purpose of the course. But otherwise, you know, anytime you let students choose their own partners, I think there's still that responsibility for them to, you know, in one way or another, connect with that organization so that that relationship isn't sort of held by the student as the sole liaison. How many hours should my students work with the organization? At USF, we have a community engaged learning requirement. The minimum hours for a course is students have to do 20 hours over the course of the semester. But we have a number of courses. We have some that are upwards of 100 hours. I would say most of our courses are probably somewhere between 30 and 40 hours that students are required to work with the organizations. But of course, in conversation with your community partner, you have to determine, you know, what's the number that they need and want and that they'll find valuable. And we've definitely had courses where, you know, if you work with a particular organization, they might have, you know, a higher number of hours that they require of students. And so students have to make the decision whether they're able and willing to do that extra commitment. And then I think, you know, I also just want to name, it's really challenging. I think students often, for very practical reasons, need and want some kind of hours measurement, but we also want to be careful to not slip into reinforcing that mindset that they're, you know, they're doing time, like they're in detention, right? Or they're just checking the box, like showing up for the hours. How do we help kind of reframe that around, you know, you're going to be working with this organization on this program or on this project for the equivalent of about 20 hours or for at least 20 hours. So I always try to like maneuver the language to really forefront, like, what is the work? What is the commitment? What is the project or the program that they're working with? And then kind of frame it as for the equivalent of X hours versus you're doing X amount of hours. Go ahead, Carmen.
Are these 3 credit courses? How many hours of class would you have also?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our community engaged learning courses are 4 credits. And it's sort of separate from, so within a 4 credit course, community engaged learning course, some of those courses might be structured where students are only doing 20 hours of community engagement and some might be close to 100, and those look more like internships. And so there's really diverse ways the courses can be constructed. But they all have to be 4 units or 4 credits for students to be able to fulfill the requirement. And then students get to sort of choose, the higher number of hours, it's more like an internship or field work where they're really like immersing themselves in the work more fully. And then the 20 hours is more like something like community garden outreach, where students are doing just more like gardening or working alongside kids to learn about urban gardening and things like that.
But are these hours accompanied by also attendance to class?
Oh, yes, great question. So like with the 20-hour
Yeah.
community engagement, then students tend to meet separately with their class. They might meet twice a week for whatever, 70 minutes or whatever it is. And then the 20 hours is in addition to those 2 class periods. When you get towards the internship courses, like 100 hours, students meet less frequently as a class. So they might meet every other week together in the class. So then the hours of community engagement start counting for seat time. So the way we set it up that way at the university, so there's a little bit of flexibility. But yeah, those are great questions that often come up with faculty. Go ahead, Joyce.
Okay, I always have to remember to lower my hand, turn my mic on, and turn my video on. Okay, sorry. And this is learning for me in terms of the other disciplines other than social work, right? So I know this is multidisciplinary that we're talking through, because in social work, in some of the other disciplines, certainly you may have like internship at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, each one has 900 hours. And so what we do to prepare students for that, right? So they're required, can do a split over 2 semesters. So these are internship courses where that is what they go to the internship, and that's what that it is. And then they have a field supervisor and they check in weekly and blah, 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 and they do, so it's monitored. So that's separate. But in the courses, we do a little different. I know you said don't let students choose, but in our courses we do. And again, and I talked to our small group, what we do is we want, in social work, this is normal. So in government and nonprofit, they expect students to call. Even if they have no affiliation with us, and I expect as a social worker, students will call me. And so that's kind of the expectation in government and nonprofit. And so we don't have any problems with that. Even agencies that are not signed up, they know this is part of the deal. And as far as our licensure, it says that you're expected to do that. So what I do in many of my classes, and again, I'm community administrative practice. That's what I do, and leadership. So for assignments, we will have students. I have 2 things real quick. One of my courses, which is community administrative practice for students to get out into community and work with folks like what we're talking about. What I have them do is first of all, these courses are asynchronous online. So students live all over the country and some are international. And so what we do is I say, okay, it's called In Your Neighborhood Where You Live. So if I have something to say, okay, I want you to talk to a neighbor about an issue. It's where you live. It doesn't matter where you live. And so they go and they talk to the person, they come back and we talk about that, and then we take the next step. What was the issue? What organization in your neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. I need you to reach out to them, put it in the chat, tell me what they said. And it's phenomenal because in every class, for every assignment, every semester, each person gets to do that, and it's life-changing for them. And so when they work on certain projects, we'll say, okay, based on your project, I have a separate class, based on your project, choose a community partner to help be your mentor. Tell me who it is. Give me the contact information. And it is outstanding every time. And so I want to acknowledge that this is social work and this is what I do, but every discipline is different. So I just want to say we do a ton of this all the time, but I want to say kudos because I don't know how the other disciplines do it. I just don't know that.
Yeah, and I think with something like social work or graduate programs where students are kind of bringing in, I think maybe a more developed sense of like, okay, I need to find an organization that's relevant to what this course is about. Obviously they have to have the responsibility of sharing back that the contact info and making sure that you can connect directly. And so I think that's where it can be really great, right? And then they really are able to lean into something they're particularly passionate about that makes sense in their own communities and in their own work. And so, yeah, I didn't mean to say any of these as like a hard and fast rule. I think if you were to ask, a first year undergraduate student, like, okay, go find an organization that works, that connects with our child psychology course about, trauma informed interventions or something. Who knows, that student's probably just going to be deer in the headlights, right? So some of this is so specific to what stage the students are in. And even still, as you were sharing, I mean, you clearly have sort of some criteria and like a process so that students are very intentional in what they choose versus just, and we used to have courses at USF where the course was maybe on like, like I don't know, drugs and drug abuse. And then students were, I don't know, like working with kids at an after school program, and there wasn't really any specific connection. So I think there's lots of variations of how it could look with students choosing their own. And to your point, like you kind of guide them through that. So it's
Right.
really, they're doing something that's completely relevant.
But thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joyce. I appreciate that perspective coming from social work.
Hi.
I saw someone else. Yes, hello,
Good. Sorry.
chimed in. Susan?
Yes, really great resources have been shared, and I'm just curious, like Joyce, I have the same, like I teach asynchronous online, and so are there examples of like syllabi that can be provided or assignments that like how you do that? Because I'd like it would be helpful for me to see how others are doing it, because I've done it one way, but I'm looking for some ideas. And so is there a repository or examples that we can share out that we can see?
That's a great question. So, Joyce, I don't know if that's something you feel comfortable sharing with the group.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in this moment, I don't, because I teach multiple classes, so I'd have to, what I'm happy to do is try to figure out how do I don't know if I send it to like one person and they can share it, because I'd have to go back and pull together some of my own, because as a faculty member, I can't see other faculty members' syllabi. Well, I can kind of, but I know I'm intimately involved with my syllabi across classes, so I'd be happy to do that, but figure out a way to send it to one person, right? Put together some examples, and they could send it out to whomever. I can't do it in this moment, but yes, I'm happy to do it.
Thanks so much, Joyce. So Nicole put in the chat that you can email her at Nicole Springer. And then there is a really amazing Campus Compact syllabus repository. I don't know how many of you access it. I've used it so many times to find examples for faculty in different disciplines. So highly recommend you go to the Campus Compact website and dig through that. And I think it's a pretty refined search engine that you can access to really look for probably like online and asynchronous things, as well as particular disciplines. Hopefully I'm not misrepresenting that, Nicole. You can chime in if I am. All right. Moving through a couple more of these questions. Going back actually to this one, what are my students and I able to contribute to community partners? So it can be helpful. I've definitely seen faculty do things like skills inventories or create Google Forms where students can share particular skills they might bring to the table. Some students might have, graphic design skills, or they're bilingual, or, these things that they bring that could be particularly useful to community partners if they know that that's something that's being offered. And then, of course, if you are working with students who are developing very particular skill sets, like social workers, then you can share with community partners, here are the types of things my students are able to do, within this discipline or within this professional field. So being able to have a sense of what those things are so that you can share them with community partners as a starting point. And then what are my expectations of community partners for fostering student learning? And what are your preliminary, I guess I would say, what are your preliminary expectations? What's your wish list of, it'd be great if partners could agree to all these things. And then maybe like, what are your, must-haves or non-negotiables? Often that's like, are they going to be available and accessible to students when they're on site? Or are they going to be responsive to student emails within 48 hours? Or does the organization, obviously, do they offer a safe environment for students, whatever it might be. Like, what are those expectations you have? And sort of the must-haves, and then maybe the nice-to-haves. It'd be great to have a partner who also wants to come in and, you know, be a guest speaker. It'd be great to have someone who wants to contribute readings to the syllabus, but it's not, you know, not necessary or required. But if you find someone who wants to do that, that can really enrich it. So those are the kinds of questions you might want to ask yourself. And then in terms of more of like a process approach, doing that initial outreach, I know there's so many folks in here who are, you know, very experienced with these things. So some of this might seem very obvious, but of course, doing that research on relevant organizations. And for those of you who don't work in public service or community engagement centers, use those staff as a resource. They can help you identify organizations that serve particular communities or address particular issues. If there isn't an existing contact, you don't already have an existing contact, or your community engagement center doesn't, you can contact the volunteer coordinator. That's usually a good place to start, or the equivalent role. That can be a good entry point. Provide details about yourself, the students, and the course. What are some things you can just share up front so that the organization can get a sense of, you know, whether it's even going to be a good fit, whether it's going to be of interest to them. Describe why you're interested in supporting the organization's work. So we do a community partner fellowship at USF, and of course I get to work with a lot of our partners. And, you know, one of their pet peeves is when faculty or students reach out and just say, oh, I noticed that you have, you know, a volunteer schedule that seems like easy for students to access. Can I send some students your way? Or can you be a partner for my course? That, you know, and then partners are like, it seems like they don't even really care about the work we're doing or the folks that we're supporting. It seems very much like, oh, this is, you know, the most expedient way to get things done. So how, you know, it's so important for you to be able to articulate some sort of connection to the organization's work. Suggest possible contributions and express openness to other opportunities. I find that sometimes community partners just need some ideas to like get their own brainstorming percolating, right? So often if you're contacting a volunteer coordinator, the first thing they think is like, okay, how can we plug students into these existing volunteer roles? And maybe that's what you want for the students, and maybe that's what the community partner wants. But sometimes, you know, depending on your course, if you want your students to do some kind of project-based work, I'll give an example. So we have an event planning with a purpose course at USF, and it's hospitality students, and they work in small groups to support organizations that are doing, you know, fundraising events or community events. And so when we do outreach for that course, when we reach out to community partners, we give them some examples of different things that students might do to support event planning process, or different kinds of events that students have supported, just so they have a sense of what's possible. And then they can come back and say, I have something, it's kind of like, you know, this fun run that your students created. You know, maybe we could make use of them. So sometimes it's helpful to prime the pump a little bit by giving some examples of what students might do without saying, these are the only things my students could do, right? And then continuing on with that process. So if you do all those things, you share that information on the front end, and the community partner responds with openness, then it can be so important, ideally, for faculty to go and do a site visit. A lot of our community partners require that of faculty. I love that. I love that they're like, we will work with you if you show up on site and see what we're about. Not all of our partners do that. Some of them are fine with doing a follow-up Zoom meeting or a phone call. But I appreciate that for some of these partners, they find it so critical that the faculty member, you know, has that on-site connection and that on-site experience. We always encourage faculty to share a draft of their syllabus, or the final draft of their syllabus, so that the community partner can see, what is this course about? Does this feel aligned with what we do? Is this something we want to invite into our space? ask the partner as you're having a conversation with them to share about themselves as an individual, but also anything that they would want you to know about the organization. And of course, you want to do the due diligence of looking at the organization's website before you reach out. So you're not asking them to repeat things that you can find on the website, but more of like the partner's inside, perspective on the history, past community engaged learning collaborations they might have done, their current goals and limitations, so that you can get a sense. It goes back to what we were talking about early on when Julie was talking about, that deep listening. What do they need and want? What are their capacities and limitations? What has community engaged learning looks like for them? What's their history of working with the university, or like what's their perception of the university? Those can be helpful things to surface. Ask whether and how the organization might make use of students and their expectations for you and the students. And then, of course, sharing your expectations for the student experience. And so that's, that's a conversation and a negotiation. I'd really love for students to do some direct engagement with young people, but I also really want them to do something that's like project-based, that allows them to use their coding skills, whatever it is. You put forward your expectations, the partner puts forward theirs, and then you sort of negotiate to a place of, is it possible for both of you to get those expectations met? Is there some overlap? Discuss and decide on engagement activities, projects, hours, commitments, timelines, feedback and communication protocols. So those are the kinds of things that are helpful to have conversations about up front. And then lastly, and I feel like this is often kind of the biggest thing that's overlooked, but so important. I always tell faculty, it's your responsibility to really be taking notes about all of this, and then to type it up and share it back with the partner so that it's in writing, and then inviting that partner to like confirm, did I get this right? Is this what we've, agreed upon? Because often when things break down, later into the term, it's because expectations weren't met, or there was like a miscommunication on the front end that never really got addressed. And because it was verbal, there's no record of it necessarily. So I think it can be some institutions have MOU templates or learning contract templates. If you have something more formal, of course, that makes sense to use. In the absence of something more formal, just, an email with bullet points. Here's my understanding of what we've agreed upon. Just want to make sure that that's, I've accurately captured that, and then allow that to be kind of the guiding document for your partnership. All right. So, and then I think it's super helpful to then kind of imagine a more expanded role for our community partners to fully embrace their role as co-educator, right? And not all partners need or want to do that, or have the capacity or interest to do that. And so I offer this up, and I always tell faculty to offer this up as an invitation, and not necessarily an expectation, right? So to what extent can the community partner, obviously they need to provide some oversight of the student. Are they also willing to assess the student's performance on site and provide some feedback? At USF, we require faculty to build that in to their grading process for community engaged courses. So some percentage of the student's grade has to be determined by the faculty member based on the feedback given by the community partner. So the community partner isn't giving the student the grade. That's not allowed, but the community partner gives feedback, and that can be, a faculty will make evaluation forms, or sometimes they'll just ask for like a very brief narrative by email, give me a couple sentences about how the student did. And then the faculty member uses that to assign some aspect of the student's final grade for the course. So asking them to assess the student. Can the community partner facilitate reflection, whether that's coming into the classroom to do it, or maybe they do that on site at the organization. A number of our community partners love to do this, even in informal ways, just in passing with students, they might throw out a question to students and have a brief conversation with them. Some of them do it more formally, where they actually ask students to, respond to bullet point questions in an email or in a document. Can they give guest presentations in class? So they might come in to do, a pitch for their organization or an orientation for the students, so that they know what they'll be coming into as they enter into the community organization. And then sometimes, those partners have such a wealth of knowledge and expertise, they might come in later on and give guest presentations about different subjects related to community and the work that they do. And ideally, we compensate them with some kind of honorarium if that's, within your means to do so. Contribute to course construction. So inviting community partners, are there any readings that you would want us to assign? Any websites you want students to explore? Do you want them to read your blog post? Do you want them to do, one thing that's kind of fun, I think we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks, is having students do like a little bit of a treasure hunt through the organization's website, right? And look for very particular pieces of information that will help them understand the organization. Maybe the community partner will help to develop assignments, depending on, what the course is about. We have a few examples at USF, and I know that these examples exist in other places, of co-instructing courses. So community partner and faculty member co-teaching, where the partner is compensated and listed as a co-instructor. I would love to see more of that at USF and more broadly. And then where can we invite community partners to be co-presenters and co-authors? So we have a practice at USF of trying to bring at least one community partner to each conference that we go to, and trying to co-present with them at each of those conferences as well. And so bringing them to that conference and covering the costs of that is sort of one way that we try to compensate them for the dissemination of their expertise. Other opportunities or other ways that you honor community partners as co-educators, or that you could imagine doing that? Or questions about, yes, go ahead, Alice.
We have them on hiring committees, especially for community engaged learning staff. And it offers a really great perspective. So it is a lot of work though, especially because we're a state institution. So there's like extra hiring paperwork, but especially for our office, it's really vital that if the person's working on community partnerships, that the community partners have a say in that. And then sometimes too, we'll do sessions where we invite any community partner to come in and speak. I know when I was interviewed for this position, that was the case. So there was a community partner on my hiring committee, but also there was an open Zoom session where all the community partners could come in and ask me whatever questions they want. And that really made me way more attracted to the job, because I felt like they were taking reciprocity seriously. And so, I really appreciated that.
Yes, so for those of us who, are kind of tapped in and have that power to help shape hiring committees, or like we have a council on community engagement at USF that has 7 or 8 community partners on it at any given time. We've brought community partners together more for like shorter term working groups. So we had some come together to help us redo our USF's mission statement. We wanted to make sure that community voices were informing that revision. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Alice. And sometimes faculty aren't always situated to think about that, but those of us who work in public service centers or community engagement centers might have a little more leverage. But yeah, how do we bring community partner voices into other aspects of informing our, the institution's work and our teaching and research and engagement? Other examples?
We also have a community partner representation. We have an awards committee. And every May we have a big celebration of community engagement. We have awards for community partners and faculty and staff and students. And we always have a community partner representative there too. And again, that one's not so onerous, you know, the applications are pretty short and it's fun to give people awards. So people tend to really like that one, but yeah, so same idea. If it's for community engagement, the community should have a say.
Yeah, I think that's that's another principle we should add to that principles list. Go ahead, Annie.
It doesn't happen at our institution currently, but where I had been previously, the community partners that were hosting either fellows or interns or some, depending on their capacity for hosting students, were able to have a voucher to audit one of the courses in the community engagement field. So there was incentive there for the supervisors to take a grant writing class or, you know, grant implementation or whatever they were interested in learning more about to better prepare themselves in their position, as well as overseeing the student in that role. So it was a really nice incentive to get partners buy-in.
That's so exciting to hear. We actually have our USF Council on Community Engagement is meeting this coming Monday, and we are revisiting something that was like the big topic from the last time we met, which is it's so like, how can we better be accountable to community partners beyond just like, oh, you know, our students can work with you or faculty can work with you, and everything from like helping them access space on campus or auditing a class that might help them develop particular skills or paying them honoraria and everything, each of those things. Well, some of those things don't actually cost that much, but the bureaucratic processes are so onerous that it can be hard. Anyway, so this is a great example, Annie, that I'm probably going to bring to that meeting on Monday, and just like, what would it look like to give a voucher or some kind of, you know, access for folks to audit a course, you know, and it doesn't necessarily cost us to have that one extra person joining into that course that was already running anyway. So thanks for that. All right, and feel free to keep, I know folks are using the chat as well, so feel free to keep using that. So the other quick thing I just wanted to share with you, and then I'll put up some questions for you to just reflect on, and we can just do a whole group discussion because we're a bit smaller group now. One of the things that we created, so we have our community engaged learning requirement at USF, and one of the things we ended up creating was this community partnership taxonomy to kind of help faculty figure out like, okay, what are the different components of partnership that I should be thinking about and integrating? And what does it look like to do that like really well and kind of like aspirationally, what does it look like to kind of do it with enough integrity that it's, you know, sound? And then what, you know, what does it look like when it's ineffective? And so this is the first part of it that I'll show. The next slide has the other part of it. There's just 5 components. So what does it look like? What does a community partnership look like in terms of integrating it into course preparation and student learning? So that's what we have here. And you can see these examples of ineffective and exemplary. And of course, I feel like taxonomies and rubrics are really difficult to I mean, there's so much subjectivity in it as well. And anyway, so please just take this as like, here's something that I'm sure could be improved upon and enhanced and revised in different ways. It's sort of a working document to help faculty think, you know, in more of a continuum of what community partnerships can look like. So these first 2 sections, course preparation and student learning, and then, you know, the other pieces of the taxonomy. What does it look like in terms of student supervision, communication with faculty, and then providing feedback and assessing student performance? So I'm happy to share this taxonomy again, which could just be a jumping off point for you to make something even better. But we found it was super helpful to have something like this for faculty to do a little bit more, prompt a little bit more of their self-reflection around what they're trying to create in terms of partnerships. All right, we have just about 10 minutes left, so let's just jump in. I wanted to just close out with some questions for reflection and action. I don't know how many of you here are actually developing a course or revising a course or teaching a course versus supporting other folks in doing that. So the questions that I'm offering up are just, we can kind of take the conversation wherever is relevant for us. But given what we've talked about today and your own context and, your role, what community or communities are you hoping to work with and why? What will you need to do to prepare for working effectively with this particular community? Again, thinking back to what histories need to be learned and honored, which organizations do you want to work with? And what are you looking for in community partner organizations? What information do you need to share with partners? So you might start coming up with a bullet point list of the things you want to share and the questions you want to ask to get information from your partners. And then what role do you hope the community partner will play in your course and potentially beyond, as we just talked about? So I'll leave these questions up here and maybe just open it up for us. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to these questions or share other things you're sort of taking away from this session in our last 10 minutes. Or if anyone wants to use this group as thought partners, if you're thinking, oh, I'd really love to work with this kind of organization. What do you all think about that? Any challenges you foresee? Go ahead, Annie.
I would love to hear if there are any resources or modules that folks maybe use or have created. We're looking to have kind of an orientation for students, whether they are in a service learning course or they're general volunteers or they are clinical placements of, how to share out like a pre-developed module that would be a very basic understanding of the local community. And I would love to hear if that has been done before. Obviously, it's very location specific, but just to see like how folks went about developing that. I know the librarians have been really instrumental for a lot of folks, and we're trying to develop that with them. But just what successes or challenges have come up in that process for people.
Great question. So while folks are thinking about that, I guess I can share, we have a place-based initiative with the Western Addition community, which is the adjacent community that I was talking about earlier. And our place-based justice or our place-based initiative director worked with librarians to put together a resource guide. And I'm wondering if it's accessible to people outside of USF, but essentially, librarians were able to pull together and curate. I think they maybe did it thematically or by topic, and I can't remember what they are right now, but different news articles or books or other resources that were specifically about like the history of the Western Addition and some of the history of redevelopment and critiques around that, the history of Japanese internment, the sort of cultural, the Western Addition was also known as the Fillmore, which was also known as the Harlem of the West. There was a lot of, it was a site for music and arts and Black culture at one time too. So our librarians were able to pull all of those things together in a resource guide that students can go, faculty can assign students to go into that resource guide and access different things. And then we also work with a couple of organizations in the Western Addition to do hosted kind of orientation walks for students. So it's folks, in and from the community walking with groups of our students and taking them to different, historical sites and different organizations and kind of sharing those histories. That's what it looks like, one way that it looks for us. I don't know if others have examples as well. Or any other questions, requests for resources, insights you want to share about community partnerships or working with community? All right. Well, I know for some of you, this is like end of work day. And so we can close out a couple minutes early. Our next session is March 14th. So hopefully I'll see all of you back here on Zoom for that. We'll talk about engaging, with students and preparing them for their engagement, and how do we think about aligning student outcomes. And so again, I wanted us to start with the community piece and then move into the student-oriented piece, and we'll kind of see how that shapes the next conversation together. Any final thoughts, questions? All right, and I know I'll be in touch with Nicole to share out some of these things we referenced, and hopefully you were able to capture some of the links to different articles and documents I shared in the chat as well. And thanks everyone for sharing your own resources and insights. And there's so much expertise in this space. So I'm super grateful to be learning from all of you too. All right, take care, everyone.